He kōna e purangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
Kia ora, nau mai haramai ki te ao hurahanga. Hello and welcome to Our Changing World. Ko klaking hanan tēnei. I'm probably chilling out somewhere in the wild right now, and I hope you're nice and relaxed too as you listen to this. E nei te raupapa pūtai ao ki te raumati. It's time for the Summer Science series, and today we're bringing you an episode from one of the other awesome podcasts produced right here at RNZ. Black Sheep is made by William Ray, and it tells the story of the shady, controversial, and sometimes downright villainous characters of New Zealand history. This episode is all about Aotearoa's most notorious wildlife smuggler, Freddie Angell. I found it totally fascinating, and I hope you do too.
Kia ora, ko William Ray tēnei. Nau mai ngā hipi pāngo. Hi there, I'm William Ray. Welcome to Black Sheep. Back in 2018, Andy MacDonald was motoring out to the far northern tip of the Marlborough Sounds. Right at the end of a craggy peninsula is a small bush-covered island. It's called Takapourewa, or Stephen's Island. At its northern tip is a lighthouse which overlooks one of the great whale migration routes, especially for humpback whales. And for the last 58 years, Takapourewa has been a wildlife sanctuary. It's home to some of New Zealand's most valuable species, including the tuatara, the last surviving member of an order of reptiles that's older than the dinosaurs. Andy MacDonald was travelling out to this island to do some work for the Department of Conservation, counting native frogs.
The frogs are nocturnal, so we basically had to wait for an hour after sunset before we could go out and find these frogs. So I had all day to explore the island and basically just do whatever I wanted. And there were some old buildings that had been used as science labs, and I think they were used as living quarters back in the past. And having sort of a rummage through them one day, I noticed that there was this dossier of information on like all these interesting things, and one of them was it was basically a report prepared by Doc for people on the island to look out for this guy called Freddie Angell. And I just started reading this, and it was just the most amazing story of this wildlife supervillain that I'd never heard of before. And yeah, I read all the papers. I sort of read them in about like half an hour. There's no phone reception on the island, so I had to wait 14 days before I went back. And as soon as I got back, I just spent all my time researching this guy, this Freddie Angell wildlife smuggler guy, and yeah, it just grew from there.
In the years since, Andy MacDonald's been working on a video documentary about Freddie Angell, talking to his family and friends, investigators, and even some co-conspirators. And a lot of those people are still around with good memories of Freddie, because this is by far the most recent Black Sheep we've ever looked at. Most of the stuff we're going to talk about happened in the 1990s, so it's within my own lifetime. Andy MacDonald's doco is still a work in progress, but he very kindly agreed to come into the studio to share what he's learned of Freddie Angell's bizarre story.
Yeah, I mean, you could definitely say he was the black sheep in his family, like quite literally. And I found that there was quite a bit of blowback. It was basically said to me to not follow this up because it brings a lot of shame on the family.
I had the same experience myself. I called up one of Freddie's relatives and they declined an interview. They said Freddie's activities had caused a lot of harm to the family over the years, and they understandably didn't want to dredge it all up again.
He definitely wasn't from a family of criminals. He wasn't from a bad family. He came from a good family, and he was just how he was, I guess.
So I hope this program won't cause undue offence, but I do think Freddie Angell's story is still worth telling. Partly because it was just extraordinary, but also because I think this is a very important story in the history of international wildlife smuggling in New Zealand. Freddie Angell's story starts down south in Otago and Southland. Freddie was born in 1960 in Mossburn, and he and his family lived in a few different towns in the region, but the people I've spoken to all knew him when he lived in Outram. It's a rural suburb east of Dunedin.
He was a harmless rogue, really, and he would think that he would get away with these things.
This is one of the teachers at Freddie Angell's old school. She's asked me not to use her name, but she knew Freddie when he was a kid. He wasn't in her class, he was in the class next door, and she remembers hearing how Freddie once stole a clock off the teacher's desk and how it was later found in his school bag.
But the stupid thing was, this happened on more than one occasion. So as soon as the clock was missing, she knew exactly where to go. It would be in Freddie's bag, and he was going to take it home.
And how old was he when this happened?
About 7, and I don't know whether he pinched other stuff from kids or not, but the clock story was a classic.
I've now spoken to about 5 people who knew Freddie in Outram, and all of them had suffered from his light-fingered habits. One of them was Colin Gilmore, a market gardener who lived just down the road.
Yeah, I had half an acre of corn, and it was disappearing. And he was going out early in the morning because he lived 2 houses away from it. And he was taking it up to a stallholder and selling it to him and said he grew it himself. And he was pocketing the money.
These thefts just got bigger and bigger as Freddie got older. Peter Thompson used to live near Outram on the Tyree Plains. He's a local historian, and he's actually the guy who helped me track down a lot of the others who knew Freddie.
My father was phoned one night by Fred, and Fred offered him 1 ton of baling twine that he had available for sale. Naturally, my father, being very straight, didn't want a bar of it and politely declined, because Fred was notorious for helping himself to goods in farmers' sheds and wool sheds in particular.
The guy I've spoken to who probably knew Freddie Angell the best is Springle Bell. He was a market gardener in Outram in the 1970s, and he had a small horde of teenage boys and girls working for him, including Freddie.
The kids liked working for me because I was a bit of a nut, okay? I'd left the boys picking up spuds, and they were having a big spud fight down there. And I said to Mum, I'll fix the little buggers. I got the 303 out, and I dropped a bullet right in behind this particular guy. I mean, nowadays I'd be jailed for that. I was telling Pressman about that. And, I'd be jailed. But the boys loved it.
Springle remembers Freddie fondly. He was a hard worker and very intelligent.
My younger sister, actually, I think taught him at school. You know what teachers are like? They said he had an IQ of about 0. And I said to her, give him an intelligence test, IQ test. Freddie was way up high and the teachers were down low.
But Springle also says that Freddie was just an utterly shameless thief.
There was a guy that buys wool in Mosgiel, from small farmers, and I used to sell wool there occasionally, and I still do. And Freddie arrived with this wool one day, and he said, that's Springle Bells. But the guy knew me, and he knew I didn't have about 20-odd rams on my days, because it was ram's wool. And he was light-fingered. He used to work on Hillside Road with a panel beater shop. And the guys that he worked for said he was sort of a natural.
At panel beating?
Yeah. I had an Escort at the time, and it had a couple of dims in it, and he was always offering to give me new mudguard. He said, I just order an extra couple, and the boss won't know. And I said, no, thank you, Fred.
According to Peter Thompson, Freddie only lasted 6 months at the panel beaters. He was fired for taking customers' cars on joyrides. One time he's supposed to have racked up 300 miles in a single weekend. So far, Freddie Angell's coming across more lovable scamp than arch-villain of wildlife smuggling. But Andy MacDonald thinks it was this panel-beating job which opened the door to some more serious crimes.
Part of the joy of panel beating was he got really good at opening safes. And he used to get his mates to come around and he'd open these stolen safes for them.
Right. So he wasn't sort of out tinkering with safes in the dead of night. It was like someone would steal a safe from a house, bring it to him, and he'd blowtorch it open or whatever.
That's what I heard. I mean, the big problem with Freddie is there's so much myth, and it's so hard to separate the facts from the myth.
It was noted in, I think, the 90s that when he was like 32 years old that he already had 8 convictions. So he wasn't messing around.
Everyone sort of says the same thing, that he was incredibly lovely, but he just seemed compelled to commit crime, and he was a thief through and through.
And was it just the excitement of it?
I have no idea what compels people to do that. I think it was partly that he was smart enough to get away with it. So, it's something he was good at. It's something you don't have to do years of study. You're either good at it or you're not good at it. And also, I think he liked the cheekiness. He seemed to be quite a cheeky guy from what the stories people tell me. He liked to find little loopholes. He liked to outsmart people. So I think the challenge of it was probably quite appealing to him.
So anyway, in the late 1970s, Freddie Angell's pottering around Otago, cracking safes, stealing stuff from farm sheds. Sometimes he's getting caught, sometimes he's getting away with it. Then, in the early 1980s, Freddie suddenly moved to Australia. And we're not exactly sure why.
Yeah, I guess you could say there's a cloud around him moving to Australia.
So he'd be in his 20s at this point, sort of like early, mid-20s.
Yeah.
And what does he get up to in Australia?
Well, as far as I can tell, he learnt to smuggle wildlife.
None of the people I've spoken to who knew Freddie Angell was a kid could remember him having any particular interest in animals. But from this point on, they clearly became a lifelong obsession.
He was absolutely fascinated by wildlife. Like, he is a guy who was just obsessed with nature, but not in a sort of what we would call a good way today. He basically saw these animals with dollar bills, sort of, he just saw them as money, and he's like, just see these parrots that he knew he could sell in Asia for, thousands of dollars, just flying around everywhere in Australia. And one of his cousins actually mentioned that was the most notable thing when he came to stay. He'd just stare out the windows at these parrots and just go, just free money flying around. As far as I've ascertained, he was loosely involved in the mafia in Australia, and they were somehow loosely involved in parrot smuggling. I don't think it was their main business, but it seemed like that was what Freddie was most interested in.
So, in a few years, Freddie has gone from petty theft and safe cracking to the Australian mafia. Seems like a pretty big jump, and unfortunately we don't know much about this period of Freddie's life to explain it. Freddie's stint in Australia came to an end in the late 1980s. In '86, Freddie was arrested and fined $5,000 for trying to smuggle native parrots out of Sydney Airport. He was deported to New Zealand in April 1990. The Aussies gave the New Zealand authorities a heads up about Freddie, and just a few months after he arrived back home, on July 14th, 1990, the Christchurch Press published news of a dramatic discovery at the local airport.
A 2-month investigation into the smuggling of native birds overseas culminated yesterday morning when 8 Kia, stuffed into lengths of plastic tubing and packed into 2 suitcases, was seized at Christchurch Airport.
The police arrested 3 people, 2 men and 1 woman, but Freddie himself managed to slip the net. Astonishingly, though, when he saw the news that his Kia smuggling ring had been busted, he got on the phone to the investigators. And those investigators were actually on camera at the time talking to the reporters. Unfortunately, I couldn't get the rights to use that footage, but it's basically Freddie saying, oh, you can't catch me, I'm in Mossburn, and they're saying, oh yes, we will catch you, we'll see you soon, and then the reporters are like, oh, you've got to admire him, don't you? And the investigator goes, oh, cheeky devil. It's great. And then next, while he was still on the run, Freddie arranged an interview with The Holmes Show, which was, the most popular TV news show in the country at the time. And again, I wish I could play you some clips from the show. Unfortunately, we couldn't get the rights in time for release, but it's maybe the most bizarre 7 minutes of television that I've ever seen. The first glimpse we get of Freddie is him wandering along a darkened street, which was the place he'd asked to meet the reporters, and he seems to have picked this spot at least partly because there was a huge mural of a parrot in the background. He complains to the reporter about the way he's being portrayed in the media. Like at one point he says, "I'm a bird smuggler, I'm not a criminal." And he says smuggling's really in the interests of wildlife because they have these bird farms overseas which help boost the population for endangered species. Even more extraordinary, when this reporter asked who he was working for, Freddie tells them. He says he's working for this organised crime group in Asia which trades in all sorts of animals, lions, tigers, snakes, lizards. And the reporter asks him if it's a dangerous line of work, and Freddie sort of sheepishly admits, "Oh, it can be if you stuff up like I do." So watching this clip is obviously kind of funny, but it's not really a laughing matter. Freddie Angell was clearly involved with some very serious people. Years later, in 1997, he told police he was working for one of the world's most infamous wildlife dealers, a Malaysian man named Anson Wong, and nicknamed the Lizard King.
Basically the main worldwide kingpin of wildlife smuggling.
So he's reputed to have been the biggest illegal reptile dealer in the world, this guy.
Yeah, he had a reputation for sort of being able to get any sort of animal that anyone wanted from anywhere in the world.
At one point, Freddie's mother apparently said there were international hitmen after her son. And Andy MacDonald says several people associated with Freddie have received death threats over the years.
I've had probably 4 people, I'm trying to think off the top of my head, who have mentioned various levels of death threats. The most obvious one I can talk about is Don Grady, who was in the throes of writing a book about his life, and he actually received quite a serious death threat, and as far as I know, he paused writing the book after that. With these things, it's always so hard to tell if they're legitimate or it's just sort of built on fear. But yeah, it wasn't an uncommon theme for people I was talking to mention death threats.
So obviously the media couldn't get enough of the story of this weirdly talkative bird smuggler. But that spotlight of publicity also revealed a wider issue that had been skulking around in the background. It wasn't just that international wildlife smugglers were interested in New Zealand's native creatures. New Zealand, it turned out, was maybe a sort of hub for the international wildlife trade. The Dominion Sunday Times put it like this in June 1990.
New Zealand suspected as bird smugglers laundering stop.
The article pointed out that penalties for wildlife smuggling in New Zealand were very limited. A maximum $20,000 fine for animals that could be worth much, much more. Plus, the police had limited power to target smugglers, and our animal permitting system was just full of loopholes.
There were also suggestions that forged New Zealand documents are being used to get protected species, ranging from African elephants to tarantulas. The Dominion Sunday Times was shown a copy of an American computer printout of animal imports into the United States. According to the list, 42 tarantulas, 43 pythons, 46 anacondas, 78 African elephants, protected black coral, and a large number of other species arrived in the United States last year with New Zealand export documents.
I can only presume, because the article doesn't quite spell this out, but I'm presuming this is just people forging papers and using the Department of Conservation's letterhead or something, not actually bringing a herd of African elephants through Auckland Airport. But throughout the early 1990s, there were occasional articles about wildlife smugglers transiting through New Zealand, including this one woman who was caught smuggling several birds' eggs taped underneath her breasts, and when she was confronted, she apparently pushed down on her chest and smushed them all, which, pretty gross. Anyway, Freddie Angell was sentenced to 6 months in prison for his part in the Kia smuggling scheme, but when he got out, he went straight back to work.
He was an absolute idiot because he always got caught. Well, mostly got caught.
This is Lindsay Hazley. Back in the early 90s, he worked for the Southland Museum in Invercargill. He was the mastermind of the museum's biggest attraction, the tuatara. It was a giant transparent pyramid, 100 square metres across and home to dozens of tuatara.
Well, all the surveys they did, the tuatara was the main attraction. I created a dark viewing area, so when you came into the museum, you came through some doors and there's no light behind, and you're actually looking onto the tuatara, facing out into Queen's Park. The animals would sit up on logs and you'd see a clear view into the park. People were able to take photographs of the tuatara and you'd think they were in the wild.
But while this new tuatara paradise was still under construction, Lindsay got a call from Customs.
We had a visit from Customs saying that Freddie Angell's in jail and he's boasting of stealing tuatara in the South Museum, and they thought they'd better warn us about this. Because we had this warning of potential theft, we spent quite a bit of money on a security system. So we thought they would be safe there with the security system. But in my lack of knowledge and wisdom, decided with the security system not having an alarm sound off. If anyone did get into the building, that'd be a silent alarm, and the police or someone would walk up and tap them on the shoulder and say, "What are you doing here, mate?" But in hindsight, that was not a good idea, because apparently in relay switches and security systems, there's a 1% failure rate. And we had that 1% failure.
On the last weekend of October 1991, Freddie Angell followed through on his boasting in prison. He came in through the ceiling, snatched up a couple of wooden burrow boxes with tuatara inside, and walked out without a single alarm sounding.
And I came to work on Monday and saw the damage to the roof and a couple of burrows and the thing. And he was able to, probably on the Friday or Saturday night, they would have needed a ladder to access the roof, fold back the acrylic plastic, drop down, and just snatch the tuatara's burrow and all out of the ground. So that was the shock and horror that they were stolen. And initially we thought there's 4 or 5 missing because of the disturbance. When I first checked the burrows, I was checking all the burrows, and okay, there's a tuatara there, a tuatara there, and I was about 5 short initially.
Lindsay later figured out that only 2 tuatara had actually been taken. Because while some burrows were empty, others actually had multiple reptiles inside them.
Which is not normal behaviour for tuatara to share burrows. So the disturbance caused a wee bit of a panic, and obviously animals run into the wrong burrow.
It didn't take long for police to solve the case. Aside from his boasting in prison, Freddie Angell also left his fingerprints at the crime scene. But the authorities didn't catch up with him till January the following year, when he was intercepted trying to post a third tuatara he'd stolen from an offshore island to the United States. That reptile was recovered safely, but the 2 taken from Southland Museum were nowhere to be found.
We never got the animals back. And I did hear that he was fighting in jail that he got 22,000. I'm not sure if that would be each or for the pair of them, but they would never have got their destination alive. I believe he smuggled them in a VHS video cassette, potentially heading to America, which may be a distribution point for collectors who are wanting unique species. But they would never have coped with that. They're so fragile.
So, Freddie Angell went back to prison, this time for 3 years. And in the meantime, the authorities got a bit more serious. In 1991, laws against wildlife smuggling were strengthened. Maximum fines were lifted from $20,000 to $100,000, plus up to 5 years in prison. Shortly before Freddie's arrest in 1990, a special 8-person unit intended to combat wildlife smuggling had actually been disbanded as a cost-cutting measure. But in 1992, a new team was established, the Wildlife Enforcement Group, with staff drawn from Customs, the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry, and the Department of Conservation.
I had people from the New Zealand enforcement team basically say that their main customer was Freddie, and that the whole reason they were in business was because of Freddie. So they had this sort of love-hate relationship. They obviously as passionate conservationists, hated what Freddie was doing, but Freddie was the reason they had their jobs.
So what Andy's saying is that it was like there was a bunch of sheriffs chasing just one outlaw. Although, as I said, there were a few other wildlife smuggling busts in the 90s, and to be honest, it's kind of hard to tell what the true scale of crime was back then, or even today for that matter.
It doesn't get the same attention as smuggling drugs or people, so it's almost impossible to say how much is actually getting smuggled. The things you can look at are, I guess, the species that show up overseas. So, our native geckos and parrots and stuff have shown up overseas for sale. So that would indicate that it's definitely happening at some level.
And back in those days, we didn't have the same customs and border control that we do now. So conceivably, a lot of this stuff's going on undetected.
Oh, absolutely. I've had several people tell me that he was successfully able to smuggle tuatara out of the country.
Successful suggests these reptiles got to their destination alive. That wasn't always a guarantee with Freddie's operations, as was revealed in a gruesome case in June 1995. Maybe skip ahead a minute or two if you're squeamish, but here's how it was reported in the Otago Daily Times.
Investigators smelt dead lizards before they found them, a Timaru court was told yesterday. The stench from the false-bottomed crate and the green liquid oozing from it was so strong officers had to wear face masks when inspecting it.
The lead investigator was Andrew Bork from the Department of Conservation. He slipped on his face mask and grabbed a crowbar.
He found 25 live lizards, about 18 dead lizards, and a turtle in a cardboard box. There was no evidence of food or water in the crate, and some of the lizards had been partly cannibalised. Because some of the animals were dismembered, it was difficult to be precise about how many had died.
The reptiles in this crate were native to Australia. Shinglebacks, blue-tongued lizards, spiny-tailed skinks and a snake-necked turtle. They were estimated to be worth at least $20,000 on the international market. I managed to track down one former member of the wildlife enforcement group to ask them about this. Rob Sewstead. These days he's actually a famous photographer. And funnily enough, Rob says that this shipment was intercepted more by luck than any clever detective work.
He had brought in a case with a false bottom, with the lizards in the bottom, but he was air freighting a garden ornament made of concrete, and I remember customs picking that up because it was so unusual. No one air freights concrete if you can help it. And definitely not a garden ornament.
So they immediately thought, I wonder if there might be something else in this package.
Exactly. And I think that's probably, for me, sums up what I know and what I've heard with Freddie, is that he had a lot of schemes that there always seemed to be something that wasn't quite right that he would trip himself up on.
Freddie Angell got 18 months in jail for his part in that particular scheme. But Freddie was nothing if not persistent. And the people opposing him, trying to keep our wildlife safe, they had to be just as relentless. New Zealand's conservation minister in the late 1990s was Dr. Nick Smith. Nowadays he's Mayor of Nelson. And Dr. Smith definitely remembers the name Freddie Angell.
I was Minister of Conservation from 96 to 99. Barely a month would go by when he would not have been mentioned in my weekly briefings. I'd hate to add up the number of millions of dollars and the hours of public officials between the Department of Conservation, our customs services and our police that came about as a consequence of Freddie Angell. There were a few other sort of instances over my 2 periods as Minister of Conservation in which other names came up, but nothing of the scale, the repeated offending, the sophistication, or for that matter, the straight deviousness that Freddie Angell brought to this pretty unique area of crime.
Nick Smith says the Department of Conservation was constantly on the lookout for Freddie, but they couldn't catch him every time.
They certainly asserted to me that they thought it was probable that he had got protected species out, That was the period in which they were substantially increasing the security on our treasured islands, whether they be down in Stewart Island, whether it be in Fiordland, whether it be in the Marlborough Sounds or the Hauraki Gulf.
Among the treasured islands targeted by Freddie Angell was Takaporewa, Stevens Island. That's that remote rock at the tip of Marlborough Sounds where Andy MacDonald went to count frogs back in 2018. It's also New Zealand's most important sanctuary for tuatara. Being such an isolated spot, Freddie probably figured it was a good place to catch the reptiles undetected. It turned out he was totally wrong about that.
It was quite funny. I talked to his daughter about a trip he made to Tekaparewa to steal tuatara. And I actually talked to the wildlife enforcement team that were watching him the entire time. And it's quite interesting sort of getting two versions of the exact same story of how he went out to the island to grab these tuatara. He thought he was being super sneaky. They were eyes on him the whole time because, you know, when the known wildlife smuggler hired a boat and went to the Marlborough Sounds, it's pretty obvious what he's going to do. So they had a whole team follow him and basically film him the whole time.
And they had like a network of like volunteer coast watchers and stuff looking out for him too.
Oh, exactly, yeah. And having been on Tekaparewa, he chose the one place on the island to land where you can basically see it from the top. There's so many places where he could have landed and no one would ever know, but he chose the main beach and he was easily spotted.
Freddie Angell was intercepted by the police on his way back from the island and the tuatara he'd taken were recovered, and he was arrested. Again. Freddie told police he'd been negotiating to sell the reptiles to Anson Wong, the famous lizard king. I actually managed to track down the lawyer who represented Freddie Angell in court for this case. He didn't want to be interviewed on tape, but he did share a pretty extraordinary story. This lawyer said that in the lead up to the trial, Freddie was extremely distressed. But he wasn't worried about international hitmen this time. Instead, he was apparently worried that he'd been cursed. Someone apparently told Freddie that tuatara on Takaporewa are considered especially tapu to Ngāti Koata, the hapu who are mana whenua for the island. In fact, these tuatara are so sacred, there's a belief that anyone who interferes with them can be contaminated with that tapu, which is something thought to cause sickness or even death. Freddie Angell, according to his lawyer, was terrified by this. He was so scared, his lawyer said he actually had to organise a tohunga, that's an expert in Māori spiritual matters, to come into Freddie's cell and perform a karakia to lift the tapu. After his trial was over, before sentencing, Freddie made a full-throated apology to Ngāti Koata for taking the tuatara.
I think he was very genuine about that. I genuinely think he did not believe he was actually hurting anyone or offending anyone by doing this. I don't think he was trying to do it to make anyone upset. He just thought it was like taking a spare cow from a paddock. It's just something that's worth money, but it's not special to anyone other than it being worth money.
Freddie Angell once again went to jail, this time for 39 months. But even while he was in jail, Freddie was irrepressible. Rob Sustad never got a chance to work on an investigation into Freddie while he was with the Wildlife Investigations team, but he did get a chance to talk to him after he was locked up.
I remember getting this call sent through from the receptionist, it was probably at lunchtime, and Freddie asking to speak to my boss, Dick Hutchinson, and that he didn't have long because he was on the prison pay phone.
And do you often get phone calls from prisoners in the Endangered Species Office?
No, he didn't. But what was really interesting was that him and Dick, it would probably be every 6 months he'd get a call, and I seem to remember there was almost a kind of an enjoyment. Freddie was quite jovial and matter-of-fact about things, and Dick was very matter-of-fact about the rules, but there was this kind of almost like a sportsmanship between the two. it was kind of a little bit of an...
Almost an opposites attract kind of thing?
Definitely.
Yeah.
And so I'd be listening over the cubicle and there was, I'd hear Dick sit back in his chair and I could imagine him putting his hand behind his head and, and just enjoying the, I guess, probably sparring. Yeah.
Seems just bizarre for an inmate to be shooting the breeze with the investigators who sent him to jail, but Andy MacDonald says this was totally in character for Freddie Angell.
He was quite a nice, affable guy. I don't think he thought of himself as a hardened criminal. I think he thought what he was doing was just simply not within the law right now. And he almost seems like a cheeky sportsman in that he seemed quite good-natured about it all. It was never a sort of raging against society or, trying to actually harm the wildlife. He didn't think he was harming the wildlife.
But of course, Freddie Angell was harming wildlife. Think of that gruesome incident with the lizards in the crate from Australia in 1995 and those poor care stuffed in plastic tubes.
Everyone always says he never had a interest in animals for the sake of animals. He certainly had pets. He had pet rats when he was a panel beater, and people talk very fondly about how well he treated his rats, and he absolutely loved his pet rats. So he definitely did love animals on some level.
But he was the kind of person to go, yes, that's a lesser African spotted grey parrot and it's worth $15,000 on the open market or something like that, and that's all he'd be able to tell you about it.
Yeah, exactly. It reminded me of the Tiger King. There's a really good follow-up to that where they talk about how the saddest thing is that no one in that documentary actually wanted to go and see tigers in their natural habitat. It reminded me of Freddie. It's like, I think Freddie was deeply passionate about wildlife, but he didn't have a passion for wildlife to be in the wild. He had a passion to make money off it and to basically use it for his own ends.
And then, just as Freddie was about to become eligible for parole in November 1998, he was busted yet again.
Convicted bird smuggler Freddie Angell's chance of getting out of jail has nosedived with his arrest for running a scam from his prison cell.
It turned out that while he was in jail, Freddie Angell had been forging all sorts of letters and forms. He was pretending to be a Department of Conservation employee with authority to legally export reptiles and birds from New Zealand to the United States. Freddie apparently hatched this scheme with another inmate whose wife acted as the middleman, sending and receiving faxes from American collectors.
People in the US had earlier received a price list for turtles, tortoises and geckos from a company Angell had allegedly set up while in jail. 2 Americans sent deposits of $3,400 and $1,500 after receiving the false doc authorisations to a bank account in Greymouth. Police said Angell set up the bank account in a false name.
It doesn't sound like Freddie actually had any reptiles to sell or any plan to get them. It was just a straight-up scam. He got another year in prison for forgery and his application for parole was deferred. Freddie Angell was finally released in the early 2000s. But then, suddenly, his story came to an end. In April 2003, Freddie was driving his Mitsubishi through Pukero, a town near Gore in Southland, when his car was involved in a head-on collision. Both Freddie Angell and the woman he collided with were killed. Years later, in 2018, journalist Gerard Hindmarsh wrote an opinion piece in the Nelson Mail outlining Freddie Angell's life and crimes. It finished with this anecdote.
I recall hearing the news about Freddie's death on the TV1 News the following night after his smash. Beside me was sitting an off-duty dock ranger who suddenly just stood up and cheered the moment he heard the news. To him, Freddie was public enemy number 1. The man Doc was out to catch, and not one bit of sentiment or sympathy entered into it. What's the lesson? I suspect it's as simple as this. If you mess with our rare birds and lizards, sell them overseas and treat them cruel, don't expect anyone to cry for you when you end up getting killed in a smash.
It's a tricky balancing act, telling the story of Freddie Angell. He did some really terrible stuff, but he's also likeable, almost comical.
And this is the biggest problem I've had with this project, is that I'm like a very ardent conservationist. I love our wildlife. I think our wildlife should be left wild. I don't think people should be messing around with it. But I end up trying to, not advocating for him, but I end up sort of speaking favourably about some aspects of what he did, not because I agree with it, but just because of, he's a guy who basically invented wildlife, modern wildlife smuggling in New Zealand. He's the Ed Hillary of wildlife smuggling. don't include that.
Put him on the $5 note.
Yeah. But he gave the greatest gift. He actually raised awareness of it. And I think in the short term, raising awareness is bad because it creates copycats. But in the long term, we realise that our taonga can actually be stolen and has a value overseas. It's not just safely sitting out there in the bush. We need to actually protect it. I think the fact that we're way more aware than we were in the early 90s before he started committing his crimes is probably directly thanks to him.
I put this to Nick Smith, the former conservation minister. Did he see Freddie Angell as a sort of accidental hero?
I think Freddie Angell did our country a service in the sense that people thought that the illicit trading in wildlife species was something that academically would occur, but nobody would be quite that deviant or cheeky to actually do it. And certainly when I took cabinet papers through both in terms of changing the law, increasing the penalties, increasing the enforcement, and getting the cooperation across different agencies, all I needed to do in the cabinet room was say the name of Freddie Angell, and I got my colleagues on board.
As for the folks in Outram who knew Freddie when he was younger, well, even though almost all of them were one of Freddie's victims at one point or another, I couldn't find a single person who held a grudge against him.
Oh, I can understand conservationists being absolutely appalled. I mean, it's like the clock thing. Steal the clock once, steal the clock twice, 3 or 4 times. And it's the same with the birds. When you knew how Freddie operated, you could only laugh at the things that he was doing. I know it was very serious, but it was just the way Freddie operated. All you could do was laugh, really.
Thanks for listening. And extra special thanks to Andy MacDonald for sharing his research into Freddie Angell, and also Peter Thompson for helping me track down the people who knew Freddie in Outram. Thanks also to TVNZ for granting us access to the clips of Freddie Angell talking with the Home Show. This is technically the final episode of Black Sheep for Season 8, but don't despair. I'm actually going to be back in your feed after a week-long break with a special bonus episode that'll be on September 27th. So make sure you follow Black Sheep wherever you found this podcast so you don't miss it. Black Sheep is written and presented by me, William Ray. Our sound engineer is William Saunders and our production coordinator is Brianna Juritich. Our executive producer is Tim Watkin. Mā te wā.